Many critical scholars have highlighted what they believe are discrepancies among the gospel records, claiming this as evidence they are unreliable. This assertion fails when we understand truly there are no real contradictions. The peripheral details of the four gospel accounts can be woven together to form a seamless narrative, as many have shown. Also, even if one eliminated all supposedly contradictory secondary details, the core observation that Jesus Christ lived a sinless, miraculous, and prophetic life, died, and then rose bodily from the grave would still ring through loud and clear. Nearly all scholars now admit the disciples really believed they had seen the physically risen Christ and willingly suffered and died for this core belief. The very existence of the gospel narratives in the entire New Testament is evidence for the resurrection's reality, since there would have been absolutely no motivation to write them otherwise. Further, in the first century world, an historian was not expected to publish the exact words of an individual, but rather was required to faithfully record the gist of what was said. So it is not surprising the words attributed to Jesus are not precisely identical in each gospel, although they are very close and certainly relay the same message. Additionally, the rules of biography for first century writing did not require one to record everything in a chronological order, so we should not be shocked the order of events differs slightly within various New Testament books. Also, John affirmed in John 20:30 and 21:24-25 the fact only a small portion of what Jesus did and said is recorded. This explains why each New Testament book contains different details. Each gospel author chose, from a vast resource of facts, the words and actions of Jesus which are most vivid to him, as he painted a slightly different yet not contradictory portrait of Christ. Further, the fact each gospel contains a slightly different yet not contradictory set of details is actually positive evidence for reliability of the all-important gospel records, since it means each account was created individually through the independent eyes of each witness of Jesus' life, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. The writers did not all sit down together and conspire to write exactly identical stories, but produced separate accounts, which powerfully verifies each author independently believed they had witnessed the same awesome events. Due partly to the independence of these accounts, we get a much greater trust in the gospel's historical truth. We could possibly question the validity of only one account, but the combined force of four independent reports, coupled with a lack of contradictory accounts from Jesus' many ancient critics, is excellent evidence that what these men said they experienced really happened. Some skeptics have said Jesus' early disciples never really claimed he rose physically from the dead, so his body was still in the tomb. Rather, these critics believe the gospel is simply a legend which was created by later Christians. This theory fails miserably for several reasons. First, many scholars have proven beyond all reasonable doubt most of the New Testament was written within 20 to 30 years after Jesus' resurrection by first century apostolic eyewitnesses. In fact, some of the creedal material includes a strong proclamation of Jesus' bodily resurrection and was recorded within a mere 2 to 8 years after the event. This incredibly short period of time leaves absolutely no room for legendary development in the presence of hostile ancient eyewitnesses. While the Jewish religious leaders and other non-Christians were highly motivated to destroy the gospel, no explanation for the empty tomb was given by them except the false stolen body story. As Geisler had explained, the New Testament records show no signs of mythological development. Indeed, the miracle events are surrounded by historical references to real people, places, and times. The New Testament documents and witnesses are too early, too numerous, and too accurate to be charged with writing myths. Only an unjustified anti-supernatural bias could ground any conclusion to the contrary. Also, we know, based upon ancient non-biblical accounts, the original disciples were terribly persecuted and willingly died for their enduring declaration Christ had risen from the dead. These men would not have voluntarily suffered for a claim they did not understand or even want to believe, especially when they knew it was a lie. Further, the first century church would not have been born and definitely would not have exploded without the immediate and truthful declaration of Jesus' glorious resurrection. This is why we should be impressed by the fact the church blossomed soon after the resurrection, despite strong persecution from both the Jewish religious leaders and Roman government. Early Christians, most of whom were formerly Jews, surely would not have endured persecution and death for a resurrection message they could have and would have known was false by simply visiting a nearby Jerusalem tomb. Additionally, first century skeptics like Peter, Paul, Thomas, James, and Jude certainly would not have given their lives for Christ unless they knew for sure he had physically risen from the grave. Yet we know, based upon the best available historical evidence, each of these men really did voluntarily suffer and die for the risen Christ. Finally, reality of the empty tomb has been admitted by Jesus' earliest critics. Jesus' bodily resurrection was surely not a later legend, and surely was proclaimed by the earliest Christians who believed the reality of these events so intensely they were willing to suffer and die for them. Some skeptics believe the disciples never meant to profess Jesus' literal bodily resurrection, but rather intentionally created a gospel fable and honored Christ by attaching divine attributes to him, although they knew his body was still laying in the grave. Their real purpose in spreading the gospel was supposedly not to promote the historical truth of Jesus' physical resurrection, but was instead to illustrate a lofty spiritual message which they hoped would be inspiring to others. This theory fails because, as anyone who has seriously studied the Bible should recognize, Christ declared he would physically rise from the grave on several occasions. There's also no doubt the early apostles preached and recorded the fact Christ rose historically bodily from the grave. Also, historical accounts indicate all the apostles suffered and or willingly died for their belief in Jesus' literal bodily resurrection. Surely not all the disciples would have joyfully suffered such great persecution and death for a symbolic idea. Further, thousands of Jews would not have been immediately inspired by a deified decaying body, for resurrection in the Jewish mind is clearly physical and not spiritual. In any case, they surely would not have voluntarily died torturous deaths under Roman rule for an embellished fable such as this. Rather, many would have recanted, and these denials would have been gladly documented by Jesus' early opponents, as well as by staunch second-century critics like Celsus. Additionally, skeptics such as Peter, Thomas, James, Jude, and Paul required physical evidence to transform their character. A mere myth honoring a dead body certainly would not have convinced them to sacrifice their lives for Christ. Also, a spiritualized gospel cannot explain the fact of the empty tomb, which was admitted in writing by Jesus' ancient enemies. If Christ had only risen spiritually, then his body would have still laid inside the tomb, and surely would have been displayed to the residents of Jerusalem by the Jewish religious leaders and Romans. Finally, the Jewish religious leaders had a Roman guard placed at the tomb, not to prevent a symbolic resurrection, but rather the appearance of a truly physical one. Both they and the rest of the first century Jewish world understood the literal and physical nature of Jesus' resurrection claims. So should we.